You have found our way to our professional development series. I'll do a couple of announcements and introduce today's speaker, but before we do that, we're going to begin with a land acknowledgement.
All right, let me share my screen and sound. I got the thumbs up from Don, so here we go.
As the first land-grant institution established under the 1862 Morrill Act, we acknowledge that the state of Kansas is, historically, home to many native nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee, among others. Furthermore, Kansas is the current home to 4 federally recognized native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sac and Fox Nation Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska.
Many native nations utilize the western plains of Kansas as their hunting grounds, and others, such as the Delaware, were moved through this region during Indian removal efforts to make way for white settlers. It's important to acknowledge this, since the land that serves as the foundation of this institution was, and still is, stolen land.
We remember these truths because K-State's status as a land-grant institution is a story that exists within ongoing settler colonialism and rests on the dispossession of indigenous peoples and nations from their lands. These truths are often invisible to many. The recognition that K-State's history begins and continues through indigenous contexts is essential.
Please remember
These truths,
because we still remember.
Thank you. All of you in the audience, you have found your way to our professional development series. We meet over Zoom at 12 noon on Wednesdays. We also record our events for asynchronous viewing. So if you go to the TLC webpage, you'll be able to find this event a little bit later today, as well as all the other events that we've had, not just this past year, but for the past several years. So if you see some stuff today that your colleagues need to know, and you will, you'll want to direct them to our webpage for asynchronous viewing of this event a little bit later. For those of you who come to a whole bunch of events, you can potentially earn a TLC Professional Development Certificate. My colleagues have just dropped that information into the chat. We have certificates both for GTAs as well as for faculty and staff. If you're a faculty or staff member who does something to extend excellence for teaching at K-State overall, you can apply to become a TLC Fellow, and information is available on that link as well. Couple of other exciting events coming up a little bit later. On Tuesday, April 23rd, Lisa Tatnetti, who is this year's Kaufman Chair for University Distinguished Teaching Scholars, will be presenting a talk called Treaties, Teaching, and First-Gen Land Grant Responsibilities. My colleagues will drop the information about how to find that event next week. There it is. My colleagues are really good in the chat. So there's links to that event. That's going to be a wonderful presentation by this year's Kaufman Chair. For those of you who are not aware, the Kaufman Chair is the highest teaching honor given at K-State. So Lisa Tatnetti wore that title proud. And we're going to see the results of Lisa's work next week. If you saw this morning in the K-State Today, there is a conference coming up on AI. AI, especially generative AI, has been a big topic of conversation in teaching and learning. If you're looking to give a panel, be part of a workshop, you can apply to that. Raylan Hale in the College of Arts and Sciences is kind of the point person for that, but you can check out that K-State Today announcement for that. And we have our SOTL Showcase coming up in just a little bit. Our SOTL Showcase will be, and my colleagues will drop that information, will be the Monday of finals week, beginning at 1:30, going all the way to 4:30 in Hale 181. We have a wonderful lineup. It looks about 10 oral presentations, about 10 posters of people all across the university sharing wonderful work that they do in teaching and learning. So we definitely invite you to that. We only have 2 more meetings after this week of our professional development series. Next week, Carrie Priest from Leadership Studies will be talking about navigating change through teaching narratives. And then our last week, we're going to have a teaching chat, and our primary topic of that chat is going to be cognitive renewal and maximizing summer breaks. We'll talk about a little bit of that, and that is going to be awesome. But before we get to any of that awesomeness, today is a need-to-know event. This is a term that we use in the TLC for our events that we absolutely must be at. And if you want a professional development certificate, you got to be at some of these need-to-know events. Today is a need-for-know event. We are so grateful to have Dr. Doris Carroll from the College of Education talking about supporting student success by reducing campus microaggressions and macroaggressions. Dr. Carroll, thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Let me take a moment to find my screen and share my PowerPoint in just a moment. There. And let me begin my slideshow. And there we go. There we go. Thank you. I appreciate all of you being here. I have some friends and colleagues here and some mentors in the house, so thank you. This is a conversation that we've heard on this campus for a number of semesters. This is an opportunity for all of us, including me, to reaffirm the importance of supporting our students. And one of the ways that we need to do that is by recognizing and figuring out ways to reduce our frequency of microaggressions and to understand and recognize what are macroaggressions. And so this is what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes. Keep in mind, as we talk about these topics, I'm going to throw out some labels and some acronyms and some phrases, but we will have time at the end of this. I have only a handful of slides, so we will have time for you to ask questions to make sure that you understand what we're talking about here. So this afternoon, I just want to do a couple of things here. I'm going to define microaggressions for you in all of its forms. Hopefully, as we talk with one another, we'll be able to give examples of how they take place on campus. I will introduce this idea about macroaggressions that are systemic insults that happen across our campuses. I will identify both institutional and individual strategies for handling both one-to-one microaggressions, or as they might occur in class, and our macroaggressions. And then I will have us think aloud about what kind of training would be useful going forward for all of us, students, faculty, staff, as we continue to learn about microaggressions on our campus. So just a simple definition, a beginning definition, let me say it like that. Microaggressions are defined in a lot of different ways in the research literature and the clinical practice literature. But simply put, they are brief, daily, verbal, or behavioral indignities. Some are intentional, some are unintentional. The outcome, however, is that it communicates hostility, derogatory, negative slights, or insults to that targeted individual or group. And as we are learning through about 30 or more years of research, it has a negative psychological impact on everyone involved. Microassaults is one type of microaggression. It's defined as conscious-based beliefs or attitudes that are held by individuals, and it's intentionally expressed or acted out overtly or covertly toward, typically it's a marginalized person or a marginalized group in our community. The example you see here, 2 examples, making racial epithets or gendered or sexualized references at work or in our classrooms, might be examples of microassaults. As I'm talking, I'm asking you to write down, where else have I seen that? Okay, so we need to learn from you as we talk about microassaults. The second kind of microaggression, micro-insults. These may occur outside of one's level of conscious awareness of the perpetrator. They are seen as subtle snubs, often unconsciously disguised as a compliment or sort of a positive statement toward the targeted person or group. The one you see on the screen is a very good example that comes out of the research and the text by Dr. Dale Wing Su there back in 2020. You write code well for a woman. I can't imagine our campus having any gender science insults like that, because we've got a strong women in science program and mentors on this campus. But nonetheless, I'm sharing it with you today. The third sort of category of microaggressions are those that are called micro-invalidations. And the research literature reminds us that perhaps these are the most insidious, damaging, and harmful because their intent is to attack or deny the experiential realities of that devalued group. I have two examples here that I've pulled from previous teachings. Color blindness. Why do we have Black Lives Matter? All lives matter. I've heard that before. That's an example of color blindness. Gender blindness in a similar way refers to a failure to identify or acknowledge the differences that exist on the basis of gender where it's significant. This example from research in 2016 talks about failure to recognize those differences in medical practice and medical research. Again, these are events, as you're thinking out loud, thinking to yourself, write down a note about how you may have heard or seen some of these micro-invalidations that may have happened in a lab, in a classroom, and yes, it happens online. So these insults, these micro insults and these micro invalidations, what's wrong with it? It interferes with our ability to reach out, to have honest, open, and genuine dialogues about special populations, about whom I don't know enough. Okay, it limits or it minimizes the importance of a person's own cultural experiences. These micro insults and micro invalidations can't happen if we're going to keep our classrooms open for learning in the fullest way. They will interfere, whether it's in a lab, a classroom, or online, it interferes with the learning process. And that's why it's so important for me, and I hope important for you as well. This slide I pulled from some of Dr. Su's work recently in a counseling text when he talks about dynamics and dilemmas, the range of things that have to do with microaggressions. Part of our challenge is it explores the reality of a host of underrepresented groups in society, many of whom are students on our campuses, both undergraduate and graduate students. It deals with the matters of both explicit and implicit bias. And across our campus right now, we have some scholars who have gone through some training that help to recognize implicit and explicit bias. We may need to, in future, identify those scholars on campus and kind of get them to talk a little bit more about that. Microaggressions, this process frames the work that you do in a microaggressive framework. That's not good for the work that we need to do as teachers, as educators, as researchers. It pushes our buttons about power and who's in charge. And the last bullet is one that will hit us in the face on a day like today. Difficult to separate the campus or the classroom microaggressions from issues, socio-political issues that may be happening off our campuses, across our communities, across our state, across our nation. All of these things get in the way for those of us doing teaching and learning and those also doing research on our campuses, both students, faculty, and professional staff. The clinical literature, my background is counseling psychology. And so over the years, I've taught those clinicians in training to recognize this. And they speak about engaging relational tools to remove classroom microaggressions wherever that classroom takes place, in a lab, in person, or online. And they highlight a couple of bullets that you see on the right-hand side of your screen. It says, remove the status quo of silence about both microaggressions and macroaggressions. Being silent is not an effective way of reducing these harmful acts or behavioral events. Give yourselves permission to discuss microaggressions as faculty peers. I have had conversations with some of my graduate students, both in my clinical classes, but also in some of my asynchronous online classes, so that we can restore the small group work they may be doing in an online environment, or it improves their recognition in a clinical context. We have to, that final bullet says, acknowledge unintended microaggressions and work to change your actions. Simple example, I teach a couple of classes that have cultural context in it, multicultural advising for our graduate program in academic advising, and multicultural counseling in one of our counselor education programs. Over the last 20 years, we have a growing range of language used to describe Latino, Latinx, Latina students. Before I stumble through that, if I'm doing, even posting something, I need to say, here are the range of, as I have asked my classes before in a simple discussion post, in your community, which of these phrases are used best to describe Hispanic individuals, persons from Central American countries? What language do you use? And then I get that feedback. So I'm not insulting someone or misidentifying someone. I'm giving myself permission to recognize I don't know this, and I need to ask my students in a way that facilitates our conversation and doesn't close the door on them hearing and listening to what we need to say and learn that day or that week, okay? Okay, this is a different offensive, hurtful practice, macroaggressions.
Dr. Carroll, can I
Yes,
interrupt
sir.
just 1 second? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Do you want questions during the talk, or do you want questions toward the end?
How are we doing with time? I could take a couple of questions now about
Okay, I had a
microaggressions. Let me
question in the
back up.
chat that was posed to me, so I didn't know if now is
Yeah.
Right.
Let's take a question before I move on to macroaggressions. Let me take a couple of questions. All
So
right.
one of our audience members wanted to know, how do we determine when to address microaggressions publicly or privately?
Depends on the context, and if it happens in a lecture class, if you take a break, you might then have the time to go visit with that student or with that individual. If it happens, you should be able, or you should find a way to acknowledge that microaggression as soon as it happens, so that everyone who hears it recognizes the need to hear the phrase differently, and you make the correction. And I can do that in a way that still affirms that individual and isn't hurtful or offensive. And I need to make sure that even my response is respectful. And sometimes that's not always easy. So it depends on your setting, I must admit, but it needs to be done as quickly as possible. Sometimes if you wait, then the others around that are watching that say, oh, well, okay, I don't have to do anything now. I can, but that's not the case, because the harm has already happened. So whenever possible, it would be nice to say, let's take a break from my lecture class, and 5-minute break. And that gives me the time to go talk with that person who made the comment and see how we can resolve that. And have I done that? Yes. Have I admitted after the break that I said something that may not have been respectful? yes, and I've corrected that, and I've had to apologize. And I do that as soon as I can, okay?
Thank you, Dr. Carroll.
Do you have some other questions?
No,
Are there
but
any
if
yet?
someone is
Okay.
not wanting to ask a question out loud, you can put it in the chat. I'll ask it, or
Okay,
and we'll help
okay.
out. Thank you, Dr. Carroll.
We have to learn, we have to collaborate, and we have to learn how to find the best way to make that happen. That's why I'm glad we have a range of students, graduate students, faculty, and staff on this program, because we need to work as a community, and doing that addresses the systemic issues that the research literature refers to as macroaggressions. They are seen as systemic or institutional discrimination, however you define that. The concern is that activity, that systemic activity, impacts an entire cultural group. Depending on what it is and how it happens, it can interject both implicit and explicit bias into the way we make decisions, institutional practices, and policies. Yes, that fourth bullet says it occurs sometimes when we, and I put myself in here for the moment, misinterpret state laws or local guidelines. And it shows, it introduces and slaps me in the face the implicit and explicit power abuse that happens across cultural groups. Now, I've not seen a policy statement in all the years I've worked in higher ed that says a macroaggression is. And even if I walk over to personnel services and have that conversation, it's still going to be difficult to define this phrase. And it means, I think, for faculty units and departments, we need to have that conversation as a faculty group. We need to give ourselves permission to say, what is this systemic or institutional discrimination? What does it look like? How does my department fit into that? That's a tough conversation to have, but it's probably one that a department or a unit has to have before somebody external comes in and we get slapped on the wrist or some other punishment, okay? I've thrown out here two examples of a systemic, what I call a systemic macroaggression. The first one speaks about a department or a college revising, doing some repair work or enhancement work in a building, building bathrooms to be sufficient to fulfill ADA compliance, but not attending to the issue for transgender students for a neutral bathroom. Has that happened on our campus? This example came from my graduate students a few years ago that had to support a transgender student going out of my building to another building during classroom breaks for evening classes. And it took me, a few weeks before I heard that. It's like, oh, okay. The second one is one that you probably have heard in the recent news about schools announcing no Black history or African American history curriculum will be taught for students. I'm not naming any schools, locations, nor states, but these are two examples. I know that you have others to give examples of macroaggressions, okay? I'm just illustrating that these are a couple of examples, okay? And I'm checking. Cheryl mentions another one might be canceling a valedictorian's graduation speech if they are from a special population or if they say something that creates offense for the school or the district, or yes, I will want to hear more about that. Yes. Now, is there anything that we can do about both microaggressions and particularly the macroaggressions? These next two bullets, slides, talk about both interpersonal and interpersonal tools that may start the discussion. Start, not conclude, all right? I'm asking us whether we're talking about macroaggressions, those things that may happen across units or systemically, or an individual microaggression. To start with myself, I need to have a self-reflection about my own biases on this matter. I need to own it and be aware of it. I need to acknowledge unintended microaggressions, and then I have an obligation to work to change my own comments or actions so that they're a little more objective and less biased. I highlighted this earlier, but the third bullet reminds us of the necessity to bring those microaggressions to the surface in a classroom or in a work interaction or a work setting. Ask yourself, how are you feeling about hearing or seeing that microaggression? Okay, and the answer to that may guide how effectively and how frequently you intervene. And that last bullet just reminds us, what must I do to reduce my own privilege bias? Whatever that privilege is, okay? And that one, we could talk about that in the whole program for a while. There are a few intrapersonal tools as well that require that collaboration with others. On our campus, it would be important if we were talking about both individual microaggressions or a set of microaggressions or macroaggressions, some kind of systemic institutional bias, that we develop partners that could help us in addressing the power imbalances. We could identify additional partners. Those might even be those at some of our fundraisers or some of our community partners who can support efforts to address these power imbalances. We can develop and sustain these community partnerships, particularly those with our underserved communities. And that's just the beginning of that conversation. I know we have some others here on the program that can talk about this one. Where are those partnerships with underserved communities? And that may be a question to start to ask in your own departments or in your academic units, okay? The research literature talks about interventions that can happen to mediate both microaggressions and macroaggressions. And I use another big term, micro interventions. The experts describe this as just the everyday words or deeds that communicate to those targets of microaggression a couple of important things. They validate the experience, the experiential reality. If someone is called a name, they show value to that targeted person. You have a right to be on this campus, I would say. You have a right to be in my class and not be harassed. Item number C reminds us about the necessity to affirm the importance and the value of their racial or group or cultural identity. D reminds us just things that you learned early in life, support and encourage others. And then that last bullet point is the reassurance that you're not alone going through whatever that microaggressive experience was. You're not alone doing it. I'm hoping you don't have to go through it again, but I need to say or act in a way that reassures that student or that colleague or that faculty member that you're not alone in going through this stuff. I'll behave myself and keep my language appropriate. All right. there are in the practice literature 4 kind of goals of these micro interventions, and they're simple. And you've heard me say it earlier in this presentation. Make the invisible visible. So don't be silent when there is a microaggression. Consult, grab a colleague. I need help. How do I disarm this microaggression that has happened in my class or has happened in a meeting I was in? Find a way to educate the offender about that meta communication that they sent. Ideally, that would happen if I could have a conversation in my office with the offender behind closed doors. Did you know this is what you said and this is how it impacted me? And or refer that offender to another office or someone else on campus that can help educate them about that meta communication and to change the action or the language. And then I don't know all the answers for all of these microaggressions or macroaggressions. There is a need for us to find and identify external support across our campuses when that event happens or in preparation for things that may happen in the futures. So these are just simple starting goals for a department, for a unit, and for individual faculty to do. There are lots of ways to make those microaggressions become visible, but we have to do that in a way that is respectful and it doesn't create additional harm. And so sometimes that challenge of being able to give feedback is not an easy process, but it still needs to happen, okay? A little bit more about these interventions. In making the invisible visible, you have to challenge the perpetrator or the offender. You have to highlight what that stereotype or the bias is. For the institutional macroaggressions, the research literature recommends keeping a log of that in those inequitable practices. We need to identify allies across campus. There are some allies on the screen here I would be calling, and solicit feedback from peers and colleagues about, am I experiencing this accurately? What do we do about it? For societal macroaggressions, again, the partnership, academic institutions with community agencies to address whatever that societal macroaggression is. We've got to work in collaboration. We've got to disseminate some research on what the impact of that macroaggression has been and organize what the research literature refers to as peaceful demonstrations. The community partnerships don't happen overnight across institutions and communities. But it's up to us to start that process, okay? We have to take charge of that. We have to give ourselves permission to reach out and say, how do I make the systemic issue visible to everyone who's impacted? Again, reintroducing these bullet points, disarm the microaggression. The perpetrator will express disagreement with me or whatever. But I have to set limits and I have to proclaim or explain, interrupt, and redirect when the comments happen. For these are not my suggestions here. For the institutional macroaggressions, over the years on our campuses, we've seen boycotts, protests, strikes, protests of all kinds. You can request a meeting with senior leadership. That has happened on this campus over the years I've been here. You can inform the press and delineate what the risk is financial and social repercussions. Societal macroaggressions, again, requires collaboration with political leaders who that we need to have a conversation with our political leaders who may reinforce what we think are inequitable or not supportive actions of others in my community. This one is tough because it's hard to happen in certain communities. As appropriate, we could have town halls to voice your concern. Sometimes that can happen in my community, sometimes not. I'm hoping we can have that in a community like Manhattan. And we need to give ourselves permission to try. That's all I'm suggesting at this point for you. Finally, the research literature talks about this micro-affirming closure or experience. It's designed as a way to enhance the well-being of all the targets, the bystanders, and the allies. And it affirms the goodness of the work that you've done to reduce that microaggression, or to start the process of breaking up the macroaggression, the systemic issues, even if they are ongoing. It's sort of a way of saying, okay, we're starting this work and that's okay, okay? I'm closing and starting the conversation now by saying both the microaggressions and our macroaggressions get in the way of our next gen strategic plan, okay? And so we have to be able to reduce those the microaggressions that happen in our classrooms, our labs, in the student union, in residence halls. We have to be able to identify first, and then reduce the macroaggressions that happen in our learning environments across all our campuses. And those harmful events have to be attended to today. Okay, thank you. So now I will stop sharing and I will open myself up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carroll. So one of the questions that I have in this kind of space is, because these are often micro, sometimes it happens and it takes a little bit to process. I can remember a time, I'm looking at Noah, when Noah and I kind of heard something that just sounded a little bit weird. And it took us a minute to kind of figure that out. And by the time we both agreed that we perceived this to be something microaggressive, it seemed like the time for confrontation had passed. So I'm kind of wondering any kind of advice you can kind of give in those situations where you're not 100% sure, like what do you do?
Whenever you come to that awareness and if you consult, after you consult with one another, it is still okay to go to the offender and say, can I visit with you for a minute in my office? And then you say, last week in our classroom discussion, I heard this. It is better, even if you believe that your comment and your concern is expressed a day late, 2 days late, it's better than not attending to it at all, okay? And I've had that happen to me online. Students in one of my small learning groups sent me an email at 1 o'clock saying, so-and-so posted a racially biased comment in the post. And I was in meetings and didn't get to it for a couple of hours. And then it was late and I didn't reach out to the posting offender until the next day. But the graduate student and I were able to have a Zoom face-to-face meeting and then to talk about it in one of my online classes. And the student owned the offense, and he went back and made a second post that apologized to the members in that small learning group, five or six students in that group. He went back. I made the suggestion to him to go back and correct that, and he he took me up on that and he did that. Now, it didn't happen immediately, but it happened. And I will just say, going forward, that confrontation opened up a conversation for me to have with that graduate student who was a doctoral student. And a few months later, he asked me to serve on his doctoral supervisory committee. Okay. And I supported him through the rest of his doctoral work. That might not have happened had I not reached out and made that confrontation to him, even though it was after the post had happened, a few hours after the post had happened. Okay. And it's not easy to do.
Thank you for that. There's a question in the chat. I'll read it out loud for anyone who's watching this video later. There's lots of parts to it, so you can use the chat to kind of refresh. But how can external support be sought when microaggressions occur in staff, and the person has said many times about it, but nothing has changed? How can microaggressions be evaluated? What happens when, from the student's point of view, it seems like a microaggression, but it may not be? Who evaluates and analyzes this when we're discussing other views? And what are the post-intervention and follow-up steps when microaggressions happen? So got a whole bunch of things to consider there.
Okay, so let me start at the beginning of that. How do I know? How do I know if it really is a microaggression? That may be a conversation with the offender and a student that heard or saw or read the comment or heard the offense. It may be, in the case, as I said a second ago, in the case of my online small group, I didn't intervene until I talked to each of the group members and said, was this comment hurtful to you or offensive? And then once I received that feedback, then I reached out. As I said to you earlier, it is not and was not then an easy process to do. Sometimes I have consulted with others. In the case of the person who made the comment in my class, I knew his major advisors, so I had the opportunity to ask. Not easy, and that may be a conversation for your academic units to have. What happens if we hear these comments? What is a strategy for us to do that? Now, I'm in a counseling program, and we have our external counselor education accreditation that gives us some direction for how we intervene with those, but not always. The other question is, how can those microaggressions be evaluated? That is a discussion we meaning faculty or across the academic unit, I think we have to have that. And in a couple of instances where I was concerned about language, sometimes I have called and gotten advice from Dean of Students Office staff or something of that nature, other colleagues across campus. The question about who evaluates and explores this, again, that's a conversation with department heads. What happened, because our student conduct language doesn't label specifically microaggressions. And that's another conversation we need to have across campus as a group of faculty or administrators and graduate students. It would be nice to have the graduate student council, in my case, since I work with graduate students, kind of take that up with the graduate council and let us think about what we could do with those. That's a conversation I think we have to have as a faculty, and also those advisors that work with them and other support folks. Post interventions, again, that's probably a conversation we as a campus have to have when these microaggressions and macroaggressions may take place. That may be a conversation for us to have with advice from some of our administrators. Okay. And I didn't answer that fully. We have others. We have others that need to join in that conversation. Okay. I will say that. Other questions?
So Dr. Carroll, another question I have, the line between an appropriate opinion and a microaggression. So kind of when you're talking, I mean, we have a divisive political climate, a lot of sensitive, controversial topics. How do you know when it's not just someone saying what they're kind of allowed to believe versus a real expression of prejudice?
Again, before I make my opinion known, and I have to recognize whatever is my implicit bias in that whatever I heard. I have to own that. But I need to talk to the parties involved, and I particularly the person to whom that microaggression was attended, and others around that individual that may have heard that. I want to hear from them what that comment or that action felt like and how it offended. And then sometimes, again, before I'm ready to slap someone on the wrist, I probably need a second opinion from one of my colleagues. Now that seems like it would take a long time. It doesn't have to be like that. But I have had conversations with individuals that have made comments in classes or posted something, as you've heard me say already. I've had those conversations. Now, not easy to do. And you have to be ready to get whacked yourself because you're going to get criticized. Someone asked a question about handling a microaggression by someone that is a supervisor. That one probably requires some third-party conversation, depending on where that happens. But it doesn't mean you stay silent about that. I think we need to follow what is in your academic unit or in your office a chain of command. Where can I go if I have a concern like this? Where can I go and express a question or ask a concern in confidence without getting myself in trouble? I need to know. And yes, there are probably a couple of places on campus. And if those of you on the screen, if you want to unmute yourself and make a suggestion, I am open for that, because I'm not wanting to overcommit a particular office or a unit, because we're talking about staff, teaching faculty, tenured faculty, graduate students and undergraduate students. So there are lots of offices that could be involved. Okay.
So I'm just going to say these out loud for the purposes of the recording. But a couple of our colleagues have pointed out the Office of Institutional Equity, as well as going to an ombudsman here as a good starting point in these type of situations.
Excellent suggestions. Yes. Yes. Absolutely. And then Dr. Saucier has a note in there about a presentation on difficult dialogues from my former colleague, Dr. B. Stoney, that is in your TLC historical listing, right? Okay.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And someone asked how we find an ombudsman person. I'm going to drop a link into the chat here in just a
Thank
second
you.
when I get that for you.
I'm glad you're asking all of the questions about where can I go. And that's a good thing. And I'm sorry, I'm not the expert to know all of those places. The important part is we have offices and units that can help you with that and give you a second opinion or another idea. Okay. There's one special population I want to attend to. Some of the research literature and some of the presentations I've seen over the years across campus here talk about racial microaggressions and gender microaggressions. But in recent years, I'm learning to attend to some microaggressions that have to do with students with learning disabilities and how they are mislabeled as acting out, or they're given some kind of derogatory psychological term. And for those kind of microaggressions or comments, I have not hesitated to call the staff from the Student Access Center and to ask them, here's what I observed, or here's what was posted in my class. It seems offensive. Help me understand this. And so that would be that's probably another community sometimes that is mislabeled because we don't understand, or we don't know, or we haven't been exposed to those in my class or in my lab with learning disabilities, a wide variety of learning disabilities. And I have the pleasure of being in a department of special education so that I can go down the hall, around the corner, and ask for some just clarity. But that isn't available for everyone. And so sometimes I have called the staff at the Student Access Center for clarity about how do I attend to this. It feels like it's offensive against this student with learning disabilities. How do I respond to that in a way that is respectful and yet doesn't additionally harm the student with the learning disabilities? Okay. I'm excited for you that you have these questions about microaggressions and macroaggressions. As a campus, we probably need to give ourselves permission to say, are there some systemic or institutional biases that we need to address as a community, as an academic community? And I'm hoping, and I encourage you to take your ideas and the questions that you have that have come up this afternoon and take those back to your academic units, to for faculty meetings. If you're an advisor and you meet as a cohort sometimes to talk about advising things with students, this might be a time to address some of those microaggressions that you might hear or see or observe, okay? I think what I'm asking us, and I put myself in there, I'm asking us to keep the conversation alive so that we can continue to educate ourselves about what do these microaggressions look like on our campus? What do macro systemic issues, systemic bias, what does that look like? It may be there, and maybe I'm calling it something else. But I'm excited and encouraged that you're asking those questions. And those questions are just timely and ripe for going back to your units and having a conversation about what that bias looks like, okay? And if we have a community of scholars that are interested in examining or writing about this, all the better. Now, there has been hundreds of articles, and at the end of this, when this goes up to the TLC when it's finished, the recording is finished and it goes into their records, I have a one-page list of readings and resources that I will add to this presentation. Okay. I'm encouraged as I hear your questions. I'm encouraged that this isn't following the idea of microaggressions and introducing the idea of macroaggressions, institutional bias. It's not falling on deaf ears, and I'm encouraged that we can continue and extend this learning and this conversation. And I can learn from you, and you can learn from one another about how we reduce these things so that they don't interfere with our ability to carry out the next gen guidelines and directions that we're getting right now from central administration. And that is what does encourage me to keep going forward. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carroll, for that wonderful presentation. Everyone, please join me in thanking Dr. Carroll. Dr. Carroll, would you be willing to share your PowerPoint with us so that we can post it on our website as well?
Absolutely. Yes,
Fantastic.
absolutely.
That was
I will
something
send that
someone had asked during this.
Yes.
I appreciate you sharing your knowledge. I appreciate you sharing your guidance on our questions. And I agree with you. This is something that we didn't do it today. This is something that we have to continue to work toward together.
Absolutely.
So I really
Yes,
appreciate
I
you being
agree.
part of this.
Yes. Thank you.
I'll remind you, we're
Thank
going to
you.
post this a little bit later today. This is a need to know event, and our colleagues do need to know this. So please let them know that this is available for their asynchronous viewing later on. Next week, Carrie Priest from Leadership Studies will be talking about navigating change through teaching narratives. My colleagues have dropped a link to a post-event survey that we do for our TLC record keeping. And I'll remind you, you can get a professional development certificate for coming to enough of these. So thank you all for being here, and we'll see you next Wednesday at noon over Zoom. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your afternoon.